Hello and welcome to Life in Focus with me, your host, Stephen Akinsanya. And on this week's show, we want to explore the school to prison pipeline. Many of you would have heard of it. Many of you may not know exactly what it means, may well have an idea what we're referring to. I want to ask some important questions about whether it's real, is it connected to youth violence or knife crime, and how do we dismantle it? How destructive is it to the progress of a young person? Now, before I introduce my guests, I would like to say that I remember as a child of the 70s certain labels being attached to me, um, disruptive. Now, whilst I was never excluded from school, I certainly wasn't, but it's easy to label a child at school without finding the root causes of what might be troubling them. And we know that once a child is labeled and it leads to exclusion, there can be all sorts of problems. And so I want to explore that today on Life in Focus. And I'm pleased to have a guest, Joel Dunn, with me on the show. Joel is the founder and CEO of a grassroots charity called the Paradigm Project. He brings a unique blend of lived experience, practical insight, and academic rigor. Currently, he's pursuing a PhD at the University of Cambridge, researching how to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And as an advocate for systemic change, his career is grounded in a commitment to upstream solutions and preventative strategies. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Joel, onto Life in Focus. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here and to discuss a really important issue. And as I highlighted at the top of the show, it's something that I'm passionate about, and I know that you're definitely passionate about. So welcome, Joel.
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, and thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Joel, I touched at the start there about my experiences back as a young child growing up in South London. And I remember that for many of the lessons, I was quite bored, to be honest. But this label was attached to me very quickly of being disruptive. And fortunately, I had parents who were quite robust and were not prepared to allow any label to be attached to me. But I can envisage situations when we're talking about children being excluded from school, uh, how that can really impact their long-term future. So when we talk about the schools to prison pipeline, what are we actually referring to, Joel?
Most commonly, the school to prison pipeline is used as a metaphor, which refers to the interconnected processes through which marginalized students are disproportionately excluded from mainstream education. And the pipeline part speaks about how they're funneled into the criminal justice system. And it illustrates the cumulative effects of punitive educational policies that criminalize student behavior. And particularly, we'll see the disproportionality amongst students of color, those from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and those with special educational needs and disabilities. And the school to prison pipeline can also be used as a conceptual framework, and that's how I use it within my research. And I think this is important because it takes the onus off of the individual behavior and looks more at the systemic issues. So when you use it as a conceptual framework for examining how those systemic qualities, inequalities, and exclusionary practices and safeguarding failures create exclusion trajectories within the education system, we're forced to look at the structural harm rather than the individual behavior.
Right. Now, I think I described you having a unique blend of lived experience and practical insight. We'll come on to the academic rigor later on, but just tell me a bit about your background that's led you to where you are now.
Yeah, I think going back to school wise, actually something that stands out from my early school journey was in primary school, my grandma was my head teacher, which was a very unique
Very,
experience.
yeah,
So lots of people in primary school, they have these high levels of bond capital. I work often in primary schools where children are embraced and there's hugs, etc., etc. And then secondary school feels a lot stricter. I actually had the flip of that, because in primary school, even though I had a very positive experience, it felt like I was always being watched, right? Because my nan was my head teacher. So I remember the feeling of going to secondary school, feeling for the first time, oh, no one's watching me. So actually, it was the time where there was more rules, there was more punishments, it was a stricter environment, but I was bouncing back off of this previous experience. And you, at the beginning of the show, when you're talking about your own experience, you spoke about labels, and labels are really interesting, right? And can be so harmful and damaging. And I definitely think, by the end of year 8, the second year in secondary school, I'd already built a reputation. I was always, academically, I got on well. I was always in the top 1 or 2 sets on my subjects, but my behavior didn't match that. So I felt like the school really didn't understand me or couldn't put me into a box. Definitely later on in my secondary school journey, like I remember for large parts of year 10, I was educated outside of the classroom so that I wouldn't disrupt the students that were trying to learn. So yeah, that label part for me was definitely part of my journey. But then I always did what was required of me to get to the next stage. And again, like you, I feel like I was understimulated in school. I didn't feel like I was understood a lot. I remember a head of year always used to describe me as Jekyll and Hyde. And I didn't even know what that reference meant until a lot later time. But the idea that we place those labels or put children in those boxes can be quite harmful. But also to counter that, I would say my behavior in secondary school, I also feel like the stance I took was that I didn't want to be understood. But now I look back, those things were a cry for help, So moving on, I went to sixth form and then decided that I didn't want to go to uni, although I had some offers, and decided to go and work. The company that I was working for went bust, and then I was like, okay, I need to let me go back to uni. But by that stage, I'd already got a taste of earning some money and having those freedoms. So when I went to uni, it didn't last long. And also something very peculiar happened where I went to enroll, and because I deferred my place, I'd already done Freshers Week, so I'd done all the partying, I'd done all of the rest of it. And when I went to enroll, they told me my course no longer exists, or they had discontinued it from the year before. So I was left with the option to drop out or to just find a space on another course. And needless to say, that didn't end up working out. So yeah, my journey through education has been, I guess, not too different from other people's. I didn't get permanently excluded myself. I definitely got into a lot of trouble throughout the whole of my school journey. But I think what was the real driving factor for me to be in the space which I am now was the experience of going to prison. So I left prison in 2016. It was my first offence. I had a very good job before that. And that experience completely turned my life upside down. And I think within prison, I realized the things that I had taken for granted weren't the common experiences of the people around me. The fact that I had completed compulsory education and gone on to further education, the fact that I had employment history and qualifications and skills, supportive friends and family, the fact that it was my first time in prison, all of these things made me stand out like a sore thumb. And it made me understand for the first time that word that makes everybody feel awkward, the privileges that I had, right? It made me understand the things that I had that others didn't. And within that same experience, I did a mentoring qualification, and I was mentoring in the maths and English department within the prison. And that was the first time I think I'd really put myself in a place of complete service to others. And it humbled me and also gave me a sense of purpose, which I had not experienced before. So that shaped the rest of my journey when I left, and I volunteered and worked for an organisation that worked with young offenders that was based in East London. And then over the next 5 to 6 years, I worked across various roles in the voluntary and the statutory sector, working with knife crime, youth violence, county lines, etc., etc.
Mm. I mean, you had an unusual or a different path from those who perhaps were excluded from school at an early age. So you'd actually taken the sort of normal route to doing your exams, having university, and then deciding not to go that way, but then to get a job.
Mm-hmm.
So things were going well for you.
Yeah. I think I would describe my secondary school journey specifically as always being on the precipice of disaster. And
Mm,
maybe that actually might be symptomatic of some of the wider underlying chaotic behavior that was part of my life pre prison.
mm,
And yeah, I think that definitely shaped. I think that's why the school didn't really know where to put me, because I was definitely naughty and disruptive and all of those other labels that you want to put to it, but I knew where the line was. And it wasn't
mm.
that I stayed on the other side of the line. I definitely danced all over the line, but
Yeah.
I knew where to, where the limit was.
Yeah.
So and I think, there were things that I could have been caught for, or things that I could have been punished for, that my story could have been very different. And definitely doing the work that I do now and seeing
Mm,
sometimes how children are pushed out of the system because they're maybe deemed as disruptive or hard to reach, or the school can't engage with them.
mm,
And then once that label is entrenched, it's very difficult to shake.
mm. Well, it's interesting that, I mean, this week I'll share with you that I was at a school governors meeting, and what was really interesting was that when we came on to discuss school behavior, and we went through the stats, and we were asking questions of the senior leadership team, we got onto the topic of exclusion. And I think the school, from recollection now, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but I think across the academic year, it was only, I think, either one or two pupils who had to be excluded. And interestingly, what was said was that in years gone past, the threshold for excluding a pupil seemed to be quite low, but the new head and his senior leadership team were committed to trying to work through with a particular young person issues that they may have, which would avoid them being permanently excluded. And when asked the question why that was, I mean, it seems like an obvious answer, but they said, look, if we're able to deal with a child who has certain issues rather than just kick the can down the road, if you like, and pass the problem on to another school, we're in the business of trying to fix the problem and let the child stay in mainstream school. And so I guess my next question to you is, how does the school exclusion impact a young person's long-term educational, social, and employment outcomes?
Yeah, I think it's important, before I answer that question, to
Yeah.
qualify that school exclusions in themselves, as we see them statistically presented, don't
Mm.
tell us the whole story.
No, they
Um,
didn't.
I always am quite wary when I engage with school leaders. And I think sometimes, because of the topics I talk about, I could be
Mm,
seen to be speaking against schools. I'm pro education. I think teachers do an incredible job.
mm,
I think, my approach is that we need more resources and funding pushed further up, not to put more pressure on the schools, but so that
mm,
there should be more resources, more staff in schools to focus on some of these specialist things. But I'm always wary when I hear teachers or senior leaders within education almost boast, "Oh, we haven't excluded a child for 2 years. We haven't excluded a child in a
mm,
year." To me, that's not something we should be boasting about until we have metrics other than academic output, which tells us how a child feels like they belong or matter within the school environment. Until we have metrics that measure something different, I think that those claims can actually be quite damaging and cloak a lot of other harmful practices, cultures, and experiences that may exist within the school. I think the evidence is very clear for the trajectory of what it can do to affect a child. I mean, some of the, I guess, most recent headline data on that topic has come from the Youth Endowment Fund, which says that excluded children are twice as likely to later commit violent offences and nearly 5 times more likely to offend generally than their peers. And also, I've seen other studies that say the likelihood of a custodial sentence is increased by roughly 33 percentage points for a child that is permanently excluded. So I think, when we look at some of the foundational studies around trauma and adverse childhood experiences in the ACEs study, we also see how that transcends from just criminalization into negative health outputs and across a whole range of areas. So a lot of the data actually around the school to prison pipeline is almost fixated on, can we claim causation between exclusion and criminalization? And there's a lot of evidence to say that there is a strong link. For me, that is not where the focus of the argument should be. For me, it's who is most affected by school exclusions, which is the most marginalized and disadvantaged children, right? And I think we know that, COVID was an example. We know that the race riots was an example. Whenever these things happen, it's those groups that are disproportionately impacted. So those groups will always suffer through the exclusion policies, and they're the groups that come off worse. So I think whilst we could spend time looking at can we claim definite causality between permanent exclusion and involvement in the criminal justice system, because we know we must also consider things like personal responsibility, and not every child that gets excluded will end up in the criminal justice system, but we must look at who we're excluding, why we're excluding them, and look at the data that says what happens to these children once they have been excluded from mainstream school.
That's interesting. So are you effectively saying that factors such as race, disability, socioeconomic background are all factors that may lead to exclusion?
Yeah, I mean, we could describe those as key social indicators, things that would help identify children as being at risk or vulnerable. Or the flip of it, we look at the other end. We look at who's overrepresented within the criminal justice system. We know that children with SEND are overrepresented at all stages of the criminal justice system. We know that children from low socioeconomic background. We know that certain ethnic groups are overrepresented in exclusion statistics and criminal justice involvement. So for me, a lot of my work and research is not trying to replicate anything that's been done. We know the who. We know who is at risk. We know who is overrepresented in that data. We know who is overrepresented within the criminal justice system. For me, it's more about the how. How do we safeguard and empower those children, support those families, and support the structures that allow those children to go on a more positive path right from the beginning. So you saw in my introduction, you used the words that I always speak about, upstream. And there's a quote from Desmond Tutu where he says, and it's a real call to action. There comes a point where we must stop pulling bodies out of the water and go further upstream to find out why they're falling in the first place. And to me, that's like my mantra. This is a co-working space, but if I had a permanent desk, that would be behind me, because I feel like that's what we need to do. And that doesn't take away from the incredible work that goes on at crisis point or intervention level. But if that's where all of the momentum and the resources are, then we will constantly be in this same cycle of dealing with the crisis of the issues without ever addressing the root causes.
Yeah, I understand. And I do want to ask you about how you see upstreaming and dealing with the issues in the way that you describe. But what when you think about that, what about the zero tolerance approach to disciplinary measures? Do you think that plays a role in perhaps pushing young people towards the criminal justice system, where you just have this zero tolerance? I think we're now sadly at a place in society where there is a lot of crime, there's a lot of youth violence, particularly you talk about knife crime, and there are sectors of society that says, oh, we should have a zero tolerance. that comes at a price, I suspect, by if you have a zero tolerance where you're not going upstream, then potentially you are pushing young people more towards the criminal justice system. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think zero tolerance policies are a really interesting one and a
Mm.
personal bugbear of mine, if I'm being honest. Um, I think there's a lot of things to consider. I think there's the contrast between the primary school environment, which is often one where I said already that is can have a higher level of bond capital, where there could be connection between the students and the young people. Also, between the children and the staff. Sorry, and also how that connects or cascades to the relationships with the parents. Whereas we go through this change in secondary school over 6 weeks period where all of a sudden a child has a lot more responsibility, a lot more autonomy, the communication is different, the school's on a lot bigger scale. Children could have had one significant relationship in a primary school with a TA or with a teacher or with a member of staff that made them feel secure, that made them feel like they matter, that made them feel loved, that made them feel connected. And then they go into these zero tolerance environments, which is a huge contrast and a huge difference, right? And I think the first thing that I would say within that is one of the tenets of trauma-informed practice is that all behavior is communication. Zero tolerance policies don't allow for the nuance of circumstance. They don't understand the individual. It's just a blanket rule that treats everybody the same. And I understand, when I am in the spaces that I occupy, I get the sense that people on one side want education to be like this utopia of educational academic excellence where everybody can go into this ideal environment and it's just primed for us to learn. That's not realistic. That's not how school works. That's not how the world works. It's real people bringing their real problems and real circumstances into that environment. And systems that fail to address them are causing harm and can be described as structural violence in and of themselves. I think it's also important to acknowledge where the zero tolerance policies come from. And unfortunately, it's something that we inherited from our American cousins, which was introduced in response to mass shootings in schools. So I think we have to be very cautious when we adopt international policy into our context, whatever that may be, whether it's negative or positive. People say in some of the Nordic schools they do X, Y, and Z, and we should do the same. There's a lot more nuance to it. There's a lot more need for interrogation and exploration before we just adopt those things. Unfortunately, sometimes things that happen in America feel like they almost get a cosign because it's being used without them actually having evidence of being positive. There's a whole dearth of evidence around the impact of zero tolerance policies and police in schools, about how it over criminalizes children, pushes them into criminalization at an earlier age. It has negative effects on their academic outcome. So we know that it has negative impacts from America that have been doing it a longer time than we have, yet we adopt it and claim that it can be a positive thing for our children and young people. So I think we look at who are those zero tolerance policies affecting the most, and again, it's over criminalizing those marginalized students, which are already negatively impacted by the rules and the structures that are within the education system.
Mm. And I mean, just on that, I mean, do you think when we talk about our American cousins, I know that in a lot of American schools, there's a police presence in schools. What I think we would call school resource officers. Do you think there is a role for having police presence in schools, even as a school resource officer, and whether that might affect the rates of exclusion from school?
Short answer would be absolutely not. I think when we look at those groups that are overrepresented in exclusion statistics and the groups that are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, they're typically groups that have fractured relationships with the police anyway, where there's mistrust, where there is a need to, from the ground up, to rebuild trust, to explore what it looks like to have positive police and community relationships. School is not the testing ground to be able to do that. I understand why some people may think that's a good thing. I think just like the zero tolerance policy, it ends up disproportionately affecting the marginalized children. I would rather see, if we've got funding to, and I know at times politically that's been a push. At the moment, that's been something that's been defunded in a lot of places. But at times politically, where that's a push, I think it can be a sticking plaster solution or an attempted but ported solution to dealing with complex behavior or school exclusions. I would much rather see that funding go to a school liaison, or a family liaison officer based within a school, or a therapeutic shield of support that exists within the school system rather than police. I feel like we're going straight to police enforcement, police force, rather than connection. You know, our children are searching for connection, yet the presence of police in the school is likely to give them consequence.
Now, just to be clear, and I always make it clear on my shows, Joel, when we're talking about the young people, we're not specifically referring to any one demographic, are we?
No. And even when we talk about when I talk about race and the groups that are overrepresented within the criminal justice system, we talk about, I mean, we have to, even when we say black children, even within, black is not a monolith, even within that, you know, there's the experiences of black African children and black Caribbean children and mixed are all very different. But also one of the other groups that comes up a lot within exclusion statistics and the criminal justice system is Gypsy Roma families, and we see those groups. So I think, and then when we look at how all of that intersects with other factors like socioeconomic status, send, etc., we need to, you know, I think that's a very important point, because this is not just one group's discussion. This is all of our all of our children, right? It affects all of our children.
Absolutely. And when we talk about, you know, the alternative approaches and support systems, because on one view you've got, well, we're talking about dismantling the schools to prison pipeline, but on the other side you've got the question, well, what evidence is there that, you know, restorative practices or alternative disciplinary approaches reduce exclusion and criminalization of students?
Yeah, I think, well, there is a lot of evidence that shows restorative practice and alternative disciplinary practices can significantly reduce exclusion and criminalization. There's recent data from Oxfordshire County Council that reveals 90% of schools trained in restorative practice have seen a reduction in suspensions and an 83% drop in permanent exclusion since between 2019 and 2024. And there's a whole other range of data that shows when those practices have been embedded that they can help reduce exclusions. I guess to offer some critique to that, maybe I would say that no program or approach is the silver bullet unless we address the systemic root causes of exclusion, and we look at how wider societal disproportionality feeds into what we see within the education system. I've just completed. You said I'm doing my PhD at Cambridge. I'm actually just finishing my MPhil and will be starting my PhD in October.
Right, I see.
So I'm just in the phase of completing a piece of research into the school to prison pipeline, and I did some work with students in a PRU that have been permanently excluded. I did some work with parents who have had children permanently excluded from mainstream school, and I used the medium of poetry to explore their experiences, and some incredibly powerful poems came out of that. And I held a reflection session for education and community leaders. And one of the common themes, so there was 4 themes that came out of each different cohort. But when I synthesized the data and looked at all of the themes together, there were three core themes or golden threads, if you like. And one of them was that the system is broken. And actually, my acknowledgement within that point, so that was reflected in what the students said, it was definitely reflected in what the parents said, came across strongly from the reflections from the educational and community leaders. But actually, my view on that is the system isn't broken. The system was never designed with these people in mind in the first place. So it's serving the people who it was built and designed to serve. And that's why I believe, almost from like an abolitionist standpoint, that the only way to move forwards effectively is to start from scratch, is to build something new without just putting the silver bullets or solutions in or covering up the cracks of what we currently have.
Wow. I mean, I guess that's all part of the dismantling process to build something new.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, kind of the school to prison pipeline theory, if you like, metaphor, it has become accidentally connected to my name because the key word is the dismantling part, right? The whole reason why I'm researching that as a concept is because I hate it, is because I think it shouldn't exist. That's why I said when I looked at the majority of the bodies of research that exist, it's focusing on the wrong thing. If we're looking at, can we claim causality, we're not looking at the fact that it's the same children, it's the same groups over and over again that are overrepresented, and we need to support them earlier. And that's where that whole upstream part comes into place, is it's not just about safeguarding, it's about empowering. That again is not just addressing individual behavior, it's not even necessarily addressing the school, it's about addressing the systems within which the schools and the children and the parents exist.
Do you have a view on pupil referral units? I've been to a couple. I'm not going to label them all the same, but what view do you have about pupil referral units?
Firstly, I think they do an incredible job with the task that they have in hand. I think they work tirelessly under a lot of pressure in what are often very intense and unpredictable environments. So I say that as a caveat to say, in terms of what the label behind them, what they're meant to do is rehabilitate, just like the criminal justice system is meant to rehabilitate and help reintegrate. I don't think there's not systems or structures that actually help children return from PRUs into mainstream school. And often it is signing a child off into a, I was going to say doomed. I think that word might be a bit too strong, but we know that there's so much data that shows us how their academic expectations dramatically decreased, the people that they're around, and how some of those things can be exacerbated by being in that environment. So I've done a lot of work with PRUs. So I say all of that with due respect for the people that work within those environments, who are just doing the best what they can, because often they're just dumped the students with the most complex needs, worst behavior into that environment, and are expected to manage them. So I think that they are not the solution, and that the work has to happen way earlier. It can't happen at that point. And often when I go into PRUs, I feel sad, because the stories behind the individuals, what it takes within that school to see success within a PRU, we can't measure it by the same standards as what we have in a mainstream school. Success, it could just be that connection that's built between a specialist member of staff that's trained in a different way to what is resourced within a mainstream school. And sometimes it's those connections that a child is longing for, that a child is yearning for, and it's sad that they get that in a PRU and they've never had that before. But I think that they have an impossible job.
Well, you sort of answered a couple of the questions that we're going to follow on. I was going to ask you about support structures that are in place for students returning to mainstream education after exclusion, and whether they're effective.
Yeah, I mean, that one is very easy to answer because they don't exist. somewhere at some level they exist in some pretty policy of what PRUs were meant to do to help
Right.
return children back to mainstream school. But those examples of that actually happening in practice are few and far between. And most children know that when they go to a PRU, they're not returning to a mainstream school, even just for the loss of learning. You know, you're on a restricted timetable, often in a different curriculum, in a very different setting. So then to be expected to reintegrate back into mainstream school is an impossible task for a child. So I think almost it's removing that kind of fantasy or myth that that's what a PRU is set out to do. Because often I think what they end up being is institutions of containment. You know, they're containing children that are viewed as problems everywhere else. And that's where I think it's going wrong, is not at that stage. You know, I don't purport to be an expert of PRUs. I think, and that's why my whole approach is what should be done further upstream, because I don't feel like a child should be getting permanently excluded and sent into those places in the first place.
That's very interesting. In terms of data, Joel, I mean, I don't know how the data is collected on school exclusions, and whether, if that data exists in an accessible format, how it's used or maybe not used to address inequalities and system biases.
Yeah, I mean, we collect national data. There's government data on exclusions every year, which tells us, you know, the ethnicity breakdown, gender breakdown, that addresses some of those factors. But again, I think they fall short of addressing the systemic causes. My research actually was and the choice of engaging with the lived experience of the children and the parents through the medium of poetry was about a reclamation of power. Because so often we read these statistics about excluded children and it is just a number on a piece of paper. Where are the voices of the people that matter the most? Like, do we hear their experiences? Do we know and understand the pain, the turmoil, the trauma of what a parent who has had to understand law and to understand school systems and to educate themselves so that they can defend their child? You know, a lot of the narrative that came across in my discussions with the parents and was reflective in their poem was almost this concept of doing battle with the school and doing battle with the system. And for me, those voices are so often missed when we just have those headline statistics of, you know, this amount of children were excluded and exclusions have gone up by blah blah percent since last year, because then it doesn't help us as a society to humanize the process of what's happening. It's very easy to just look at those statistics and skip over it, when we know that every individual that goes through that experience, we're affecting the rest of their life outcomes. That's the severity of it. You know, we by making those decisions, we're impacting sometimes the rest of their life, and not just that child, but the entire family.
Yeah. Now, as an advocate for systemic change, to get the word out, you've talked about upstreaming, you've talked about finding solutions and preventative strategies. What policy or legislative changes would be most effective, do you think, in dismantling the school to prison pipeline?
So again, just because I've just finished my research, I'm primed to answer this.
I knew you would be.
Out of the process that I did for my thesis, I have 6 recommendations, and the first one is center mattering in school culture and policy. So implementing school-wide mattering audits to measure students' sense of belonging, value, and agency, and also including that as a key data metric in school self-evaluation and inspection frameworks that sit alongside academic attainment. I think that speaks to a radical reimagination of what we're measuring within the school, because as long as schools are primarily judged on just academic output, and I say that by acknowledging that academic output is important and ultimately what children are in school to achieve. But if that's all that we're measuring, we're going to keep repeating and perpetuating these same cycles of disadvantage. The second one that I have is mandate and fund a whole school relational approach. Again, moving beyond one-off training days and embedding trauma-informed pedagogy and restorative practice as a core ongoing professional development requirement for all staff, from senior leaders to lunchtime supervisors. And I think it's crucial that there must be funding within schools for smaller class sizes and dedicated time for staff to build relationships with children. That came really key within the research, was that there was always, in all cases of the young people that I spoke to, there was examples of positive relationships where there was almost like this wish that they had more of them. And it seems like such a simple thing, but I think that relational side is critical. The third one is to conduct radical equity audits and set anti-racist benchmarks within the school. I think we can't ignore race when we're talking about the disproportionate impact of exclusions. So again, what are we measuring within the school that holds schools to account to prioritizing race and setting that as a benchmark within what schools are measuring? Forging genuine family partnerships through co-design. That disconnect between parents and the schools was profound, not just in my own research, but that's reflected in wider literature as well. I think, I spoke earlier about why don't we have funding for dedicated family liaison officers within a school whose role it is to build bridges and not manage compliance. And that, often cases, it's the school engaged with the parents around a crisis or around an incident where there should be relationship that is outside of that. And I think that would be really key. My fifth recommendation is invest in a therapeutic shield of specialist staff so that those family liaison officers would be part of them. But I think that's a big part. And again, I'll reiterate that this is not about putting additional stress on an already overstretched school system. This is about pushing resources and funding further upstream to fund additional roles that bring this into the school space. So that would mean investing in a multidisciplinary team of in-house counselors, educational psychologists, speech and language therapists, and partnership managers that can connect the schools to the local solutions, organizations and initiatives that can often be the hyper-localized solutions to whatever is happening within that school environment. And lastly, commissioning a national listening exercise, the Who Matters inquiry, as I've called it. So I think it's important that, what really came across in this process was that a lot of these parents that spoke, and I was profoundly moved by the parents' insights and stories and journeys, but in the space that I was able to hold for them and create for them, that this was the first time they felt like they'd been listened to. So for me, that recentering, and I spoke about almost building from the ground up, that it shouldn't be the number statistics that we can reel off at a national level. It should be the voices that form the foundation of rebuilding a system that empowers and serves those who are most in need.
Mm-hmm. Now, on that, when I first met you, Joel, a few weeks ago at an event, we were both speakers. I remember you read a poem that was just so powerful, and it speaks to the issue you've just mentioned about parents not feeling as if they're being heard. And that poem that you read was so powerful. Yeah. I want to ask you, how important is will and desire when we talk about policy change? Look, you've given us 6 key points that you think are important in dealing upstream with this issue of dismantling the school to prison pipeline. But with that comes, as far as I'm concerned, in the annals of power, you need will and desire to make it happen. Is there an appetite?
Yeah, well, I think, and I say this a lot, that change is disruptive. All change is disruptive. And so is growth. If we look through history, if we look through recent history, if we look back as old as time can go, there was never a significant change without disruption, right? And I think sometimes we can almost romance ourselves into this idea that it can be this, hand-holding process where we sit alongside. And actually, I've realized that I think my experience in Cambridge has emboldened me in this position and how I see myself. But, I work across voluntary sector. I guess my work straddles the education space, criminal justice, but I don't belong to any one space. So, even in the work that I'm doing, the choice to use poetry was a liberatory choice, was about the participants and how they engage with it. And actually, the participants all said, we want these poems to be heard. So that wasn't my intention with how I would use them. And actually, I feel like that's symbolic in some ways of how my journey has been, because those poems almost become like a Trojan horse, because it's easier to invite me into a space for me to share poems about an experience. And maybe some people might think that that's going to end with a warm, fuzzy feeling. But I know that by design of what I'm researching, by the questions that I'm asking, I'm thinking about who am I disrupting and who am I holding to account, and I think from my personal perspective, the allies that I'm forming in this space have to also be like-minded. And of course, there's ways to do things, right? There's ways to I don't like this phrase, earning a seat at the table, but there's a ways to get into the rooms. There's a way to be heard. But ultimately, I feel like I see in many cases where sometimes you get to those places and then you can end up losing some of your drive or your forthrightness because you've now succumbed to that same system that you're trying to disrupt, or that's now the system that is feeding you. So I think that change's disruptive mantra is core to my whole approach, and by design, I'm thinking about that. So. And also, I'm encouraged by the fact that there is the will and appetite amongst people within my network and the people that I connected with in academia and in professional spaces. I think the difficult part is that will and desire shared amongst the people that can actually make the changes and make the difference.
Absolutely fascinating conversation, Joel. Can I ask you about the Cambridge experience? When I met you and I heard you speaking about the PhD, I mean, I had a huge level of respect anyway. I just wanted to know about, if you're able to, that experience, that environment, Cambridge, what's that like?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally like Hogwarts. It's a complete shock to the system, because my only other academic experience of higher education was for less than a year that I lasted when I did my undergraduate degree, started my undergraduate degree and dropped out, which was almost 15 years ago. So now at this point, it was how it came about actually was through research I was doing through my organization. When I started my organization, it was all around delivery in schools, and then COVID happened. And I was at the time based at the Stephen Lawrence Center and doing some work with Blueprint for All, who were at the time of Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust. And I ended up, cut a long story short, doing a piece of work with Deloitte, who supported me to do a piece of research into how the pandemic affected the transition from primary to secondary school. Now, I was managing that from a business perspective. I was managing the survey team, I was managing the psychologists and all of the people on the ground. So that was my first taste of a large scale research project. But I didn't know that I was priming myself for a skill set that I would use later on. And actually that experience changed the trajectory of the organization and made me realize I don't want to just focus on scaling through delivery. Maybe using this research and being able to come at it from a different angle with the perspective that I bring can ultimately be more disruptive. So it was through the recognition of some of those pieces of work that I was invited to apply at Cambridge. And that was through somebody that I was working with that I actually met on LinkedIn, actually. And I think that is also testament to, again, because I engage with children and young people, we know how powerful it is. We spoke before we jumped on live about planting seeds. And I think this journey has been testament to people that believed in me more than I believed in myself, because I think one of the most powerful things that have come out of Cambridge is the external validation happened, but I think that's been a byproduct that has happened just because the name of the institution has been attached to my name now. But I think internally, it's made me realize that I'm taking up space in this sector on the mission that I'm on that I need to take up. And I think that internal validation has been really key, So my course in itself, the prerequisite was 4 years of leadership experience in education. My experience is unconventional compared to what most people's are, either heads or deputy heads in schools. So it's been connecting and studying with people that I would have probably never met in any other walk of life. So it's been a really interesting process. But one of the most significant people within the institution that has been a big support and a big reason why I'm even continuing to go on to PhD is Professor Jason Arday, who's my supervisor, and he's incredible and has pushed me from the beginning and expanded my thinking and the ways that I'm working. So I feel really grateful and blessed for the opportunity, but also I'm aware of the dynamics of what it means to be there. And I use this phrase, squeeze all the juice out of the lemon, and that's exactly what I intend to do.
Well done, superb, Joel. I mean, that I'm a passionate advocate against knife crime in the work that I do, and even this platform. And I guess, like me, you watched the Idris Elba documentary, and you'll be aware of previous campaigns in different guises with different people over the years that we've tried to get to the bottom of this knife crime issue. What were your feelings about that documentary?
I actually had some quite strong views about the documentary. And I don't, it's nothing personal against Idris Elba. I think it's the way that I have an issue with the phrase around raising awareness around knife crime. We see it in these celebrity campaigns or something that a football club might do. We don't need to become more aware about knife crime. The people that know about knife crime have been affected, are impacted by knife crime, know all too well the realities and the tragedy and the pain that is caused by knife crime. I feel like it can move us away from action and hold into account the people that have failed to make the decisions and the choices that would positively impact the lives of the children and young people who are most affected by this, the families as well. So while I think he was clearly well-intentioned in the work he's doing around knife crime in general and putting the documentary together, I don't think it's addressing the root causes. And to speak to what we just said about change being disruptive, I don't think it's disrupting anything, So also, it doesn't need a celebrity to be talking about those things. There's people on the ground who are doing the scathing deep work, who are doing the working on the front line, who are doing all of that work, which are far better qualified and positioned to be able to speak to this issue. And I think that's one of the most frustrating things is, we like shiny things. We like bells and whistles. And when a celebrity swoops in to speak on any issue, we deem them as the all-important voice. So I think, my views on that were more frustration and a distraction from action that needs to be taken. We can talk about blunt knives and banning this and whatever, but unless we're addressing the structural root causes of the issue, then we're just regurgitating the same conversation, packaged in a different way, represented with a different face. That's going to create new headlines Yet we still see young people dying to knife crime within our community and within our society. So yeah, that was my thoughts.
In fact, I think you said research shows that exclusionary practices in schools are not mere isolated incidents. They form part of a broader systemic failure that funnels our most vulnerable children into pathways leading to the criminal justice system. And in fact, there was something else that you said which I actually highlighted, where you said instead of ranking schools solely on academic outcomes, why not measure our success by how well we empower and develop the whole child socially, emotionally, and academically. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, that to me, and you've heard that through my recommendations and through the themes of what I said, and that kind of need to start from the ground up, that radical reimagination of what we're measuring is probably the single biggest disrupting factor that could change the way that our education system works. Because if we was to develop a structure or a framework of an alternative metric of measurements, what we're measuring within the school, it would change how schools have to work. It would change what schools have to do, how they have to treat and engage with students. And again, that's not putting the onus on the schools themselves. It would change how they have to be resourced and able to achieve that.
Wow. Well, Joel, I did warn you that the time would come around very quickly, and our time is pretty much up. But I want to thank you for a fascinating, enlightening conversation. You've been a great guest where you've really opened up a very simple phrase of, well, dismantling the schools to prison pipeline, but you've really dissected it and given us 6 key areas where we can achieve that. And as you say, it will require disruption. And so I want to thank you for coming on at Life in Focus and sharing your expertise and your knowledge and wisdom, your personal experiences. And I know that certainly when we meet again, certainly on this platform, I'll have the pleasure of introducing you as Dr. Joel Dunn. I have no doubt about that. But Joel, for now, I want to really thank you for coming on the platform. And I just want to actually finish with something that Joel has said. He says such a paradigm shift, and he's talking about upstreaming. And he mentioned a quote by Desmond Tutu: "We've got to stop picking the bodies out of the water and go further upstream to find out why they're falling in." And he says such a paradigm shift could ease the relentless pressure on public services and reduce the burden on the voluntary sector, which often is left to patch up the gaps. And so when we talk about dismantling the schools to prison pipeline, it's not about zero tolerance. It's not about sticking kids in pupil referral units. We have to go upstream. And if we go upstream, it means we have to invest. And we have to invest in people. We have to invest in strategies and those people who are best placed to deal with these issues. So that's food for thought. Let's continue being disruptors, because with disruption comes progress. But I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my guest, Joel Dunn. And again, Life in Focus is a community production where we seek to inform, change, and inspire. And I will see you on the next show. But for now, thank you for watching. My name is Stephen Akinsanya, barrister at law at 15 New Bridge Street. I'll see you next time. God bless.